Right, 2018's political season is heating up. Our pollster is here to explain it all.
The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Many of you who watch the Friday night program know that we record the Friday program on Thursday, and I always offer this disclaimer that all heck could break loose between Thursday and Friday, and we have to catch up on Monday. And of course, we're heading into the holiday season. We've got some production issues that we'll be dealing with, but I'm just being candid about what we may or may not miss. I also want to remind you about what happened here last night when we had, like, I don't know, what do we have, Lexi? Kind of like a spiritual experience occur here when former state representative and Trump honorary chair Joe Trillo talked about the process of his decision to run for office. We're going to talk about that tonight. Welcome in, though. Thank you very much for tuning in. So I kind of, and because we are challenged turning two programs around at the same time, we could only get limited video. I reminded Mr. Trillo yesterday that only 3 weeks prior, he had absolutely, unequivocally suggested and stated that he was running as a Republican for governor. I mean, less than a month ago. And then he talked to me about you know, what happened, and that, you know, he saw the tea leaves, that he had some kind of Bernie Sanders issue equivalent with the Republicans here in the state, that it was just a bad experience. He didn't think it was going to be, you know, productive for him, yada, yada, yada. And that, you know, he more or less accelerated, so he could be honest with people about what he was doing, his announcement time frame. I don't exactly remember what question I asked or where the conversation was, because we just cut this from yesterday's show, which we actually just recorded a moment ago. But I wanted Joe Fleming to see it for the first time and get a reaction to it. This was Joe Trillo being Joe Trillo.
No, I still believe that it's way premature for the election cycle.
Do you have an itch to scratch or something?
Here's what happens. Here's what happened. Once I made this decision, Dan, I had to get out of my skin. I had to shed it right away. I can't go look at people and face people and talk to them as a Republican knowing I'm going to leave the party. So once mentally I got there, I had to do it. It had to be done now.
He had a shed, you know, it looked a little bit more profound sitting in that chair than they had done on television, but he was freeing himself. That's Joe Trillo.
Yep.
Right?
Well, I mean, Joe obviously believes he has a better chance to win the governorship as an independent than as a Republican.
Well, it's fun. Just a month ago, he was absolutely certain that he had to win the Republican primary to do it. Welcome in, Mr. Fleming. Great to have you.
Thank you.
So 18's heating up in late 17,
oh, yes.
Isn't it? What's your take on this? And do you really think it's only because it's the only story we have right now in the governor's race that it got too much attention? Is Joe Trillo a playa?
Well, that remains to be seen. Obviously, on the surface, because he was Donald Trump's campaign coordinator or manager in the state of Rhode Island, he has a lot of credibility. Former Republican state representative, Republican National Committee man. So he has some credentials. The question is, can Joe Trillo put a campaign together? Can Joe Trillo raise the money that is needed? Remember, the governor's starting off with like $3 million. Alan Fung, Patty Morgan has to raise a great deal of money for the primary, but whoever the Republican nominee is can get outside money from Washington to help them. Joe Trillo has to raise it all himself. It's going to be a lot harder for him. If he can raise the money, he can become viable. We've seen independents get 20% last time with Bob Healy. We've seen Lincoln Chafee win as an independent and win an awful lot of Democratic votes. Doesn't mean Joe Trillo is going to get Democratic votes. But if he can raise the money and get a message out there, I also believe Joe Trillo is not a household name in the state of Rhode Island at this point. A lot of people know him, but they don't know a lot about him. So that's going to remain to be seen over the next 6-7 months on how people identify with Joe Trillo.
Well, that's actually an interesting thing that you just said. I'm often intrigued and confused, actually, about recognition. Yep. So, when you find that you get a lot of I don't knows or unsures, right? When you give that option, tell me how you feel about Dan Yorke. Don't like him, little like him, don't like him at all, somewhat like him, whatever it is.
Yep.
But then you,
know.
and his 52% don't know
Right.
or won't say.
Correct.
How heavily weighted does it usually come in the don't know versus won't say? Meaning, yeah, I know who he is, but I'm not sure what I'm thinking. A la Joe Trillo
Well,
now.
for example, if I'm doing a Jack Reed,
Yeah.
the don't know is going to be like 5% in the survey. If I'm doing a Joe Trillo, my guess would be it would probably be up around 50%, because they may know the name, but they don't know anything about him.
So does
Now,
but okay,
that gives somebody like Joe Trillo a lot of room for growth, in the sense if he has the money, he could shape his own image in the voters' mind. They don't have a preconceived image of Joe Trillo.
Right.
If he can get out there and get an image out there of himself, that could be a positive for him as the campaign moves on.
So don't knows, no recognitions are assets if you've got the sourcing
Correct.
to brand yourself.
When Don Kajiri first started running for governor in Rhode Island, he wasn't really well known. He was known in the business community, he was known in some circles, but he was able to get out there and brand himself, win a Republican primary, go on to win the governorship.
Paid for most of it.
Yes, he did.
Well, I mean, he raised a lot of money, but
Right.
he paid for most of it.
Yep.
Now, Trillo is no, it's just funny, a longtime Republican said to me the other day, a little miffed that he's gone independent, that Trillo's gone independent. He said, Trillo's got a lot of money, but he's one of the cheapest SOBs I know, and he's not going to spend a lot of his money. I did not ask him about that yesterday, and there's a lot of time for that kind of a thing. But he probably has to write himself a little bit of a ticket.
I would think he would have to put some seed money in it first, and then he has to start raising the money. When you have money, it's easier to raise money. And the question is, being an independent, I really believe it's a lot harder. When Lincoln Chafee ran, he basically paid for a lot of the campaign himself when he ran for governor the first time. So, I mean, I would think Joe Trillo has to put money in up front. And he has to also probably try to contact a lot of those Trump people that he knows and try to raise money through them.
All right, so, you know, the Republican leading candidate, obviously, is Alan Fung on Jump Street. Here's what Alan said to us recently as well.
I'm actually in. I'm going to be running all the way through hard till next year. I'm not afraid of any primary opponents. I've got a lot of respect for both of these individuals, but the main difference is, you know, as legislators, they do a lot of talking, a lot of fighting on the floor. As a mayor, I've acted. You know, I've fixed problems. I've handled big budgets. I've handled many employee issues that have popped up and done what's right for all of our residents. And I'm proud of all the things that we.
He's well known.
Yes.
He ran last time. You know, he lost by 6 points in a three-way race. He still thinks that, you know, Bob Healy, God rest his soul, the former, what's the name of the party? Coolmoose?
Coolmoose.
Although he wasn't a cool moose as he was running. We lost Bob suddenly last year, and it's heartbreaking for a lot of people, because he was another one of the interesting fabrics in Rhode Island. But Fung thinks Healy robbed him of the governorship. I'm not sure of that.
I think a lot of Bob Healy votes are people who felt they couldn't vote for Gina Raimondo as governor, and they didn't want to vote Republican, so they had no alternative. Now, if he wasn't in the race, would they voted for Alan Fung? I don't know. Or would they just not voted in the governor's race? That's something none of us will ever know. But a lot of people, the conventional wisdom is that simply, if Healy wasn't there, Fung probably could have won the election. But that's not a sure thing.
So Fung, during that race, you know, had turmoil with his police department. Things were kind of hanging around his head. Since then, he hasn't had much controversy. Will all that stuff carry with him, or is he able to cut a new, fresh look?
Well, I think the Democrats may try to use that on him this time. But remember, he ran for re-election in mayor in between all this and won overwhelmingly. So the people at Cranston did not hold any of these things against him.
Right.
So the
He's
question
going to
is,
run against Mike Seepy, who, with, you know, all due respect to Mike, he's a colorful guy. I don't think people took him seriously.
well, I mean, the thing is, if they were more concerned with the issues with Alan Fung, that's where they may have voted for Mike Seepy.
Yeah.
But Alan Fung did very well in that election. The question is, will that move to with the Democrats to try to use that again? I'm sure that'll be one of the things that we'll try to use on Alan Fung if he's the nominee. He has to get through Patty Morgan first.
He put out some data, as we say in Rhode Island, on him in Raimondo, suggesting his own polls have him up 5 or 6 points. But he also disclosed data that I thought was not so smart to do, which is that he was at 45, Pat Morgan was at 25, and Joe Trillo was at 10. Now Trillo is running as an independent. Patty Morgan hasn't lifted a finger and was sitting there, you know, 20 points behind with a whole bunch of nobody knows her. That's pretty good for her.
When I saw those numbers, I felt exactly the same. Here's somebody with 25% of the vote, who's just coming out of the gate, is not well known statewide, and 25% of the Republican primary voters said they would vote for her. That's a good start for Patty Morgan.
Yeah, that's some of her video that she put out. But Kev, if we could switch off of that for a second and see if you can find that comment that she made about her motive for running for governor.
The tolls came up. When some of this bad stuff happens, I can't stop it as a minority leader. And I think that I can have a better impact. I can help people in the state more if I'm governor.
Well, I mean, the tolls are one issue, but it's only one part of the whole question. You know, if she can really get herself known and identify with issues that the voters are around and concerned with. Right now, obviously, the state budget is going to be one of the big issues in the 2018 election, I believe. You know, can she come up with some alternatives for that to get the budget under control? Here's the thing that Governor Raimondo's got going for her. She's been grabbing headlines for business, you know, advances. I don't like her formula, but you can't deny that there's been interesting stuff going on, Infosys being one of them.
These are jobs at every level. As he will say, they hire folks with a college degree and folks without a college degree, folks with a credential, folks with a PhD in engineering, and they're planning to train. That's what Infosys is known for, training people.
Can she break through her 40% ceiling?
I'm not sure how high the governor can actually get. The 40% is what people are saying the job rating's been most of the time. It hasn't been more or less a head-to-head number. The one poll with Alan Fung showed her at 41%. The question is, does job rating transfer into votes? In a lot of cases it does, sometimes it doesn't. For example, David Cicilline had a job rating of in the 20% when Brenda Doherty ran against him, and David Cicilline won the race by 12% of the vote. So it doesn't always mean that. The big advantage the governor has right now is the fact with Joe Trillo in the race, he's not. I do not believe he's going to take votes away from the governor. I believe he's going to take votes away from the Republican nominee. Which is why when Joe announced as an independent, you said the happiest person in the state was? The Governor Raimondo, an early Christmas gift. She now no longer needs to get to that 50% mark to be reelected governor. All right, when we come back, well, a little bit more on the governor's race because there could be another, you know, an addition or two. And then we'll talk about the Senate race, which is now materialized, and the pulse of the country on some key issues like sexual harassment, believe it or not. Stay with us. And then there's this guy. Speaking of name recognition, Joe, he's got all he needs, or all he wants, right, or maybe too much of what he has. Lee Chafee, our former governor and U.S. Senator, continues even today. Friday shows are taped on Thursday. Right. He told Tara Granahan on WPRO that he's even more enticed to run right now since Joe Trillo got in the race, but in typical Chafeean fashion, says that's why, you know, he's even more committed to thinking about it. But if he does, he'll run as a Democrat, which kind of nullifies the Trillo factor. Yeah, that surprises me a little bit. I thought if Lincoln Chafee ran, he might run as an independent now that Joe Trillo's in a race. That would make a four-way race for governor with four candidates that have some money, that are somewhat known. And the governor, former Governor Chafee, always had a base of support. It may not have been that big, but he does have a following. I mean, and you would only need about 31% of the vote to win in a four-way race with four competitive candidates. Going in the Democratic primary, obviously he believes, if he does run, that the liberal Democrats, the progressives, the environmentalists, those people will come over to him in the Democratic primary. But I have to believe the governor has a big advantage of the party structure in the primary. He could write the ticket, though. Yes, he could. You know, but it'd be a Donnybrook on the Democratic side. He has more support of the public sector unions, not necessarily the private sector unions. Yeah. So. But keep in mind, you say he has the support of the public sector unions. I'm not 100% convinced of that. Remember, well, teachers. No, he signed the legislation with the pensions. So they don't necessarily think they're going to go and just jump on Lincoln Chafee's bandwagon. Yeah, but they don't like the governor either. No, but they may just stay out of it. No, yeah, that's true. True. But if he went left, I mean, fake left, go right, and go as an independent, there we go. He has his favorability ratings had to be in the low 20s when he left. So he's got to grow himself by 10% to win. I think the amnesia that people have makes it completely plausible, and only Link Chafee would hold on to a concept
like the Christmas tree being called the holiday tree, to say, I'm running as a Democrat because I've run around too much. He'll convince himself of something that won't do himself any good.
Well,
or he's just feigning right now, and then he dumps into the race as an independent.
That is a possibility. I don't think we really know. I mean, he says he wants to run as a Democrat, but I'm not 100% convinced of that. He may look at the picture and see he has a better chance in the general election than in a primary. Remember, his job ratings are only in the 20% range, but if I do remember from the polling, his job rating among Democrats was around 40%. So his polling better among Democrats. So that might be why he's looking at a Democratic primary.
Ah, see, you got to get the intricacies of the big pollster here to understand some of the thinking process. On the Senate side, you know, Bob Flanders is now in the worst, best secret in politics, right? So the former U.S. or the state Supreme Court justice, rather, receiver in Central Falls, longtime well-known lawyer, is in. I call him a blue chip candidate. Do you?
I think he could be, but again, he has a Republican primary. And in Rhode Island, you never know what's going to happen in a Republican primary.
Well, this guy Nardolillo, in fact, do we have a picture of that? Our bad. But Bobby Nardolillo, who actually thinks, had the audacity on the radio a couple of weeks back to tell me that he thinks that Flanders is the deep underdog in this race and that Flanders should get out of the race. The Republicans can't afford a primary to suck up resources in a fight against incumbent Sheldon Whitehouse.
Right. I would think the Republicans would be better off having one candidate, not having a Republican primary.
Somebody's got to go to dinner with somebody.
Well, we saw when Lincoln Chafin, Stephen Laffey had the Republican primary, Sheldon Whitehouse was able to win the seat for the U.S. Senate.
Right.
So primaries, I think, at the Senate level is not good for the Republicans because now the national people cannot come in and put money in early to help build up the Republican candidate. Rhode Island's a very blue state, but if they feel there's a chance to take Sheldon Whitehouse down, I think they will put money in it. But now they can't do that to after the primary. And again, we're talking a turnout of somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people. So you never know what's going to happen. There could be something here where you have the upset. We've seen it. When Congressman Ron Makeley was running for governor, he was in a Republican primary against former town administrator Lincoln Almond. And Almond beat him in that primary. So, I mean, you don't know what's going to happen in the Republican primary. Things change quickly there.
All right. Well, if I was, you know, if there's $50 on the table that says you have to bet, I would bet that Flanders will be the general election choice of the Republicans.
I would think right now it looks like he's going to have the resources to get through the Republican primary better. But again, with Republican primaries, it's hard to say because polling is very difficult to do in a Republican primary in Rhode Island.
All right. Well, listen, I'm listening to you. I'm not ignoring you. So I have to listen to something inside you is trying to tell us don't be so sure about Flanders in a Republican primary. But let me ask you this. Flanders across the board in a general election is wholly more votable than an unknown state rep from Coventry.
That I would agree with.
So if I'm running the party,
right?
If I'm Brandon Bell,
right,
and I have any skill whatsoever, I'm getting Nardolillo the heck out of this race.
If you're looking at the general election,
yes,
you would say Flanders.
Well, that's how you get elected.
Right. Yes, I agree. You're saying Flanders is the better candidate in the general election.
Sure.
And that would, on paper, that does make sense.
Right.
So the question is, will the Republican parties try to eliminate the primary? That's all behind the scene politics in Rhode Island. You know, whether they try to do that and get him to run for something else,
right,
or do they let the primary go on?
Despite who comes out of the primary, beating Sheldon Whitehouse, a gargantuan task.
Very difficult.
Right.
And in that race, I think Donald Trump will be a factor. Because the Democrats, when Sheldon Whitehouse got elected, and I remember, Dan, you said this on the radio back in those days, because I was saying all Sheldon Whitehouse had to do was run against George Bush. And you said, no, that's not the case. And that's what Sheldon Whitehouse did. And he won saying, don't let Chafee be the 50th vote in the Senate to give the Republicans control of the Senate.
I didn't realize that Fleming's got markers on me when he's won an argument.
Just once.
You win.
Just once.
You win most of them. You're the guy with the data, as they say in Rhode Island.
However, I think Whitehouse could do the same thing this time. Use it as part of his campaign.
I think you're absolutely right, which is why I was telling Trillo, leave the Trump stuff alone. Be authentic.
Right.
Tell us your issues. Battle. But don't carry Trump baggage around.
Well, that's going to be tough for Joe Trillo because of all the stuff he has said over the years and what he supported with Donald Trump. So that's going to be very tough for him. But somebody like a Bob Flanders can try to stay away from that more. and try to be more of a moderate Republican in Rhode Island, which is what you want to be if you want to have a chance to win the Senate seat.
So when we come back, we'll just mention some of the developments this week in the national politics and how they affect us here at home. Stay with us.
Nevertheless, today I am announcing that in the coming weeks, I will be resigning as a member of the United States Senate. I, of all people, am aware that there is some irony in the fact that I am leaving while a man who has bragged on tape about his history of sexual assault sits in the Oval Office, and a man who has repeatedly preyed on young girls campaigns for the Senate with the full support of his party.
Like him or not, point well made.
Yes.
So, how does this advise the races here, the Roy Moore stuff in Alabama, or does it at all?
Well, I think what you're saying is you've noticed a lot of the Democrats have already said Franklin should step down, because if they want to keep criticizing Judge Moore in Alabama, they want to criticize Donald Trump, they can't support Al Franken.
They had to clean themselves
They had to
out.
clean themselves right out.
And he knows that.
Right.
He's a victim of circumstance. Well, he's a victim of his behavior that he argues, and perhaps his reaction to the behavior, but he knows he's a victim of circumstance.
Yes, at this point. I think if the Alabama race was not going on, he might have tried to stay and worked his way through this.
Right.
But because this race is going on, it wasn't going to happen.
So White House and Reid both, jumped on the
Right.
bandwagon yesterday morning. Flanders says, "Hey, you ought to return the money that you got from
Right.
Franken over time. It's $15 grand."
Yep.
And you know what I hate, Joe? I don't know if it bothers you. White House is going to send it to charity.
Yes.
Send it back to Franken. Political money is free speech.
Right.
Send it back to where it comes from if you want to disassociate the relationship. The charity thing is just ridiculous.
That's the normal thing that most of them do. They don't want to give it back to the person. They want to give it to someone they can help with.
Yeah, because they don't want to do
But
what's
what-
the accurate and correct thing.
You're even seeing like Judge Flanders here in Rhode Island. I think, if I'm correct, he came out against Roy Moore in Alabama.
Right.
Because again, he's trying to play the moderate Republican in the state of Rhode Island, being very smart. He doesn't want to go too far to the right, because that in Rhode Island isn't going to play that well.
So we're going to have some hearings on sexual harassment with Teresa Tanzi, who's our hashtag #MeToo participant. Will the sexual harassment and behavioral issues that have dominated the news cycle in the last couple of months have any impact on our local elections in 18?
It could, depending on what else comes. If anything else comes out from the State House in Rhode Island, you never know. I mean, with the way things are coming out, you never know what you're going to hear. But again, you don't. Right now, we're in December. You don't know what issues are going to be a big factor come next September. It's hard to tell. This issue may be all going away, and there might be something else we're talking about.
And what's fascinating about the work you do, and Fleming Associates is the company, people decide they want to lead or run,
Right.
but they may or may not be equipped to do so based on what comes up, and they need to know what's
Yes.
coming up. 10 seconds. That's an interesting dynamic, isn't
It is. I mean, we sometimes do surveys for people, and we find out simply that you're not the candidate people are looking for, and we tell them you really shouldn't run for office. Or at the same time, we say, well, here's some issues in there that people are concerned about that your opponent has no idea about.
And they could be fluid, is the
Yes.
point. Great analysis. I could do this all day with him. He was right back then, remember? Last word, come back, stay with us. So there was news this week that a young lady who's transgender is running against a longtime state representative, John Lombardi. Other than her status that way, I'm not sure what was newsworthy about that. But I'm taking the bait, and she will be my guest on the Monday program. So join us. Don't forget to join us 5 days, from 3 to 6, 5 days a week on WPRO. I need the weekend. So do you. See ya.